The topic of the Civilian Aide of the Secretary of the Army program is one that I believe is not really very well known, nor really appreciated across our force. It's actually a force multiplier, whereas as a field grade and senior officer, if you have a relationship with the civilian aide in your area, I think you would find that to be a real benefit. But regardless of where you're stationed across CONUS, there's probably a CASA that's appointed to cover your area, and I think we're going to see that in the briefing here. And part of their job is to assist you with your mission. Today we got the privilege of having the CASA for Eastern Kansas to talk to us about this program and how the Secretary of the Army, Dr. Mark Esper, uses his civilian aides to keep the public informed about why a strong and robust Army is vital to our national security, and also to advise him on regional and local issues, and to promote good relations between the United States Army, Congress, and the American people. Mr. Michael Hockley is a partner in the law firm of Spencer Fane, LLP in Kansas City. His practice concentrates on litigation, environmental law, and renewable energy. He serves in leadership roles in a variety of civic, professional, and business organizations, to include being a founding and current trustee and current chairman of the United States Army's Command General Staff College Foundation Board of Trustees, which is our parent organization and our governing body. He's the past chair of the United Way of Greater Kansas City Board of Trustees. He's been a treasurer, Board of Regents for the American College of Environmental Lawyers, and is a member of the Board of Directors of Armed Forces Bank. He's named amongst the best lawyers in Kansas City as the Kansas City Environmental Lawyer of the Year in 2012, 2016, and 2018. And he's received the Ben Craig Distinguished Service Award from the Overland Park Rotary Club back in 2014. Mr. Hockley graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point and took his law degree from the University of Nebraska College of Law. He was named as a civilian aide to the Secretary of the Army for Kansas East in March of 2018. Please welcome Mr. Michael Hockley.
Thank you, Rod. Just a few administrative things before we start, and one announcement. I don't know, everybody here probably knows Rod mostly through his work with the Simon Center. And as Rod mentioned, that the Simon Center is part of the Commander General Staff College Foundation. It's one of our programs. Well, as of next week, is it the 17th, Rod? Rod will become the CEO of the foundation. You probably know that Doug Tystad is stepping down after doing great service for the foundation. So why don't you all join me in congratulating Rod. This may be the only really public announcement for this. As I go through my presentation today, please feel free at any time to ask questions. And if the folks who are in the outer seats, if you want to come up to the tables, there's plenty of room at the tables where there are microphones. But if you're comfortable back there, that's fine too. I'm going to start by giving a program overview of just talking about, who the, so let me make sure I get this, I point that direction. There, okay. Who we are. The one thing that caught my eye when I was approached about becoming a civilian aide to the Secretary of the Army is we're a special government employee. And I thought, well, that's great. It might be some supplemental income, but unfortunately, no. We're unpaid, but we actually are part-time employees. We get a CAC card. We have access to all this, and that there are benefits to it, but there are also detriments, which I'll discuss later when it comes to things that we can and cannot do. We're treated as if we're government employees, so there are some certain things that as a government employee you cannot do, like endorse specific companies or things like that. So we're actually appointed as experts and consultants under U.S. statute. And we get reappointed annually, although we actually are appointed for a 2-year term. As a technical matter, we have to be reappointed each year. I first was appointed I actually received my appointment papers in March, but I was sworn in April of this year. The people who serve as CASAs, as we call them, Some people call them CASAs. I was calling them CASAs until I went to my orientation and they told me, no, it's a CASA. So I guess knowing Spanish doesn't help. Anyway, they try to pick people from the community who are business leaders, who are active in the community, who kind of have their hand on the pulse of the community. And they do that because they want to make sure that people who are serving as CASAs can serve as kind of a liaison between the Secretary of the Army and the community. And I'll talk more about that later. The one thing that's interesting to me, and I had no idea this was the case, is that they actually are afforded a 3-star protocol status. So when I attend events here, it'll be General Lundy, and then General Arter, who's a retired 3-star, and also a CASA Emeritus, and then me, and then the 2 stars and 1 stars, which that's kind of a weird feeling, you know, when, you know, I was just a lieutenant colonel when I was in the Army. So, so it's better late than never, I guess. We are appointed to 2-year terms, and those can be renewed up to 5 times for a total of 10 years, and that's a recent change to the regulation. I think many of you know General Arter. General Arter served 7 terms, 14 years, but that can be waived, and in certain instances it is, but there's kind of a movement afoot right now, I think, with the new secretary, Dr. Esper, wants to get some younger blood into the thing. So what did he do? He appointed a 67-year-old guy as a young CASA. But my class, when I was brought in and sworn in, most of the people were younger than me, but there were a few who were older. So it's still kind of an older group. And one of the reasons for that is it takes a lot of time. And so to find people who have made all the community connections they want, who have the time to commit, it typically you know, sort of focuses on people in their 50s and 60s who have already gotten to that point where they're comfortable financially in it, and it isn't a burden on them to serve as a CASA. So what do we do? I'm going to give you kind of a quick overview, and then I'll go into more detail. But we provide feedback to the Secretary, and I'll talk later about how we do that on public sentiments toward the Army, you know, the concerns and things. Now, right now, I think that the public is very positive on the Army. But, you know, this program dates way back, and we'll get into that later. But, you know, back in the 60s, it would be very different. You know, when I was a cadet at West Point, and I started in '69, right after the Tet Offensive, it wasn't a real popular thing to be in the Army. So I imagine that the CASAs back then had a much different experience than I've had now when you go out in the community and talk to people about the Army. But we also, we work closely with the Army commanders, not just to provide public sentiment, but to, excuse me, but to talk with them about what their concerns are. And we can share those. You know, we have to be careful and discreet about how we share them with the Secretary, but we can share some of that too. Also Guard and Reserve and others in our area. And really, one of the best things we do is we give out the Army story. It's just like if you think about Fort Leavenworth, what's the story at Fort Leavenworth? Well, if you ask somebody in Kansas City who is right down the road, they'll say, oh, Fort Leavenworth, they've got the prison. That's not what Fort Leavenworth's about. It's part of it. It's a very minor part. But as you all know, we have CAC. We've got the Army University. We have the Commander General Staff College, which I think most of us think of as the intellectual center of the Army. It certainly is where doctrine and things like that are developed. But people don't understand that. So that's part of it. So one of the things about CASAs are they are for general areas. So even though I'm disseminating the information about the Army story that I tell is about around here. And so that's part of the Army story. So where do we serve? Well, there's at least one CASA per state, and also in the District of Columbia and in the U.S. territories. And the Army appoints the CASAs just based on needs, population, and geography. And there are 118 positions, plus 26 emeritus. And emeritus are people like General Arter who served honorably as CASAs and for a long time. There's time for them to step down, but that's a position that gives them the opportunity to still be an ambassador for the Army, but it allows them to have a CASA come in behind them. One of the interesting things that I was told in my orientation was that even though there are 118 positions right now, people serve long periods. I mean, there are some CASAs now who were appointed like in '97. There have only been 500 in the history of the program. So that's a pretty small group of people. I'm sure that that's going to change as this 10-year, there used to be a 20-year limit on terms. But as this 10-year goes into effect and as we add more CASAs in certain states. So the 118 that we've had represents more than a quarter, 28% growth in the last 2 years, and that there are 26 CASA emeritus, and that's it. This is all as of March of this year. Of those, you can see what the distribution is. You can see that the majority of them have served less than 10 years, and almost half less than 5 years. So there's been quite a bit of turnover lately. I think I mentioned before I was appointed when General Arter was elevated to the emeritus status after he served for 14 years. We need to work on diversity. We've got 87% male, 13% female. But that's, I think, a historic thing more than, in my particular class, half of us were male, half female in terms of gender diversity. 82% Caucasian, again, that's not exactly the kind of numbers we want. 18% African American, Hispanic, and all other. So it's a pretty disproportionate share are Caucasian. That's changing. In my class, I think we had there were 8 of us, there was one, and I think 2 were other than Caucasian, so that's a little bit better than that. The majority of them have former military service, and then there are 17% are flag officers. In my class, we had 2. One was a retired National Guard Major General, and one was a retired Brigadier General. And then there are a lot of West Point graduates. I'm not sure why they do that. We don't know the community any better than anybody else. But so here's the distribution, if you want to see it. In Kansas, we have 3. There is John Montgomery is the CASA for Kansas, and he's the one I was talking about that I'm aware of who was appointed in the 90s. And then I think they split out Kansas and added a CASA East for Kansas East, and that was General Arter. And then Bob Edwards, I think, or Brian Edwards is the CASA for, it's called CASA West, and both he and John Montgomery are out in the Junction City area. So I don't think John Montgomery does a lot now, so if you think of it in terms of Kansas, you've kind of got the Fort Riley and everything east of Fort Riley is sort of where my jurisdiction is. We both have responsibilities for working with the Guard, but since the Guard's spread out all over the state, we're not going to work with all of the same people. So that's the distribution. You can see some states like Texas, I can't even read that from here. I don't know. Anyway, Texas has quite a few. California also. And that makes sense because they have so many military installations in those areas. These smaller states, I just went to a conference. They have conferences, which I'll talk about later, every year. Regional conferences, you go to a regional conference every other year. Since I didn't get to go to the annual conference because it was in March before I was appointed, I was invited to the Northwest Conference, and that consisted of, Nebraska, the Dakotas, and everything west of there. And in those states, there's only one state that has an Army installation, a big installation. That's Washington State. The rest of them are all National Guard and reserves. So those states have kind of a different requirement for CASAs. They spend most of their time working with the Reserve and the National Guard. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the history. This started back in World War I. It was part of what's called the Military Training Camps Association. That association was actually begun during World War I to do a number of things. One of the things was, it's called the training camps. They didn't have enough training camps when we started up and joined the war. And so they reached out to civilian leaders to try to help them secure training areas and training camps. So they actually went out and found a lot of the different, like the Fort McCoys and places like that, all over the country for training camps. And then that kind of morphed into a formal recognition of the civilian aid concept. And so instead of being the MTCA, they decided, all right, we'll call these civilian aids to the Secretary of the Army. And we'll use them in a number of ways, but many of the ways are similar to what they use them now, but it was more decentralized. In 1950, they expanded it to be more of a link between the military and the community instead of just using them as a resource. For example, back during World War II, they used them a lot to try to help them recruit officers who had very specialized skills. You know, it would be kind of like today if you're trying to recruit people with cybersecurity experience or something like that. Well, they use the CASAs to do that. They use them in clandestine ways that we can't talk about. So there were lots of different uses for them, but they realized that it was a pretty important way and resource. So in 50, they kind of expanded the program and formalized it more. And it was a headquarters Department of the Army program initially. Then they decentralized it to make it all down at the local commands. And pretty much during the early years, each CASA just pretty much did what he thought was appropriate. You know, there wasn't a whole lot of guidance. And I'm not sure that it's changed that much, although they tell me it has, because I haven't gotten a whole lot of guidance on what I'm supposed to do other than just go out and meet a lot of people and tell the story. But starting then it centralized again in 2003. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Department of the Army structure, but they have an Office of the Administrative Assistant. And that's a pretty powerful office. It's kind of like I guess it'd be sort of like the Chief of Staff maybe for the SecArm. And we report to that guy. And right now that's a vacant position. Tim O'Keefe was the person who was doing that when I was sworn in. And he just retired in June. So the position's open, they're trying to fill it. But they have a staff of about 6 or 7 people in the office that deal with the CASAs. They organize programs. We have to submit reports and things I'll talk about later. So that staff is kind of our contact with the DA. They've tried to focus on getting more people in urban locations and diversity, as I mentioned before, and with limited success in the diversity, but I think they're doing better. There is actually an Army regulation that governs all this. It's AR1-15, and it was updated in March. That's when a change occurred with the terms and things like that. And one thing I found interesting is that the other services don't have this program. Which is really odd because I think it's a great program, and I think it really is valuable for the services, especially the local commanders. And because the program was so successful, the reserves decided they wanted to have a similar program. So they started something called the Army Reserve Ambassador Program, and it's modeled after the CASA program. So they focus just strictly on the reserves. We focus on both, reserve and active duty. Okay, so what are some of our requirements? Well, we have to submit significant activity reports, and on the next slide I'll show you, what types of activities we do. But we have to report the number of days that we've worked. We submit that twice a year, and we cannot work more than 130 days per year. And if you work even an hour in a day in official capacity, that's considered a day. So they don't count like just doing administrative stuff, like if I'm in the office trying to count up my days or prepare my reports or review all of the, we get like 3 or 4 daily briefing emails, which I cannot keep up with. But when you're doing that, that doesn't count as a day. But when I come out and do something like this is a 1 hour, hour and a half presentation, that counts as a full day. Now, it takes a lot of time. I've got to come all the way from Kansas City, and so it's about almost 3 hours of my time, but that's a whole day. I'm not sure what happens if you do more than 130 days, but the way I look at it is I'm only going to report 130 every year, so I don't think it's going to be a big deal. It's not like I'm getting paid for it. So we annually have to submit a conflict of interest statement. I don't know, do you all have to do those? And it's pretty interesting. The OGC will, the Office of General Counsel will look at it, and in mine, I thought, oh, I'll pass this in flying colors, because they were talking about how, you know, some people are defense contractors who do this, and it's really hard to get them through the different hoops. But so because I'm the chairman of and on the board of trustees of the Commander General Staff College Foundation, I can't do foundation work on the same day that I do CASA work. And that's because I guess it would look like if I'm out soliciting funds, for example, for the foundation, that would be a conflict. It would be, and I understand it if you put your hat on and think about, okay, I'm a government employee today, I can't go out and ask for funds for an organization. So that does make sense. So I had to sign a recusal statement that I wouldn't do that. I also, as a lawyer, occasionally represent clients against government employees, a lot, as a matter of fact, because of the EPA. I'm an environmental lawyer. I probably spend a quarter of my time fighting with the EPA over something, or working with the EPA. But in either instance, I can't tell them that I can't use my position as a CASA to help my client's interests. So I had to sign a recusal form relating to my work whenever it involves the Department of Defense. And as an example, I'll be doing a mediation in March, and I've been retained by several private parties, including municipalities and some universities on one side, and the Corps of Engineers and the Department of the Army on the other side. Well, I'm not really a party, but I have to make sure that I don't, I had to disclose ahead of time that I'm a CASA for conflict of interest purposes, but I can't perform CASA duties on the days that I do the mediations for that. And then we have to do annual ethics training, and that's completed annually at the annual conference. So here are the things we have to put on the significant activities report. So we have to share, there's these different categories. What do we do to share with civilian communities? And that's like any interactions we have, meetings attended or initiated, social media initiatives. I'm not a big social media guy, so that's not going to be a problem. But we have to just do that. And then this part down below there that says include recommendations for improvement. So that's where the feedback goes back to the Secretary of the Army's office. And I'm told that the Secretary of the Army gets he gets all of them, and his staff goes through and kind of highlights key things, and then he actually goes through a book and reads them, and we have to submit these twice a year. What kind of assistance have we given to Army leaders? So what do we do to support National Army or local Army leaders? Well, I've attended a number of different things here on post. I've discussed with our congressman some of the concerns that the Army leaders have. So those are the types of things that could come up there. Assistance to Army families, any activities, I'm so far I've not been involved in that, but I'll give you some examples on the next page where some people have. Any political engagement. So if we met with congressional delegations and things like that. A couple of weeks ago I was in Washington, D.C. With the Chamber of Commerce, but I was able to meet with with our two senators and a congressman and his military liaison, their military liaison staff, and I was able to talk a little bit about CASA issues when I was there. And then, so there is like a separate section for us to just put, these are things that we think that should be discussed with the secretary, and it could be community concerns, public perceptions, or issues and concerns. And one of the big concerns that I see in my short time as a CASA is the op-tempo, especially for National Guard and Reserves. I met with the commander of the 35th Infantry Division headquarters right after they came back from their deployment. They'd been deployed about 10 months, and by the time you add on their ramp-up time and their coming back time, it's over a year. And he was telling me, well, we're going to go right back in 3 years. You know, when you're talking about National Guard, people who have civilian jobs, having to leave every 4th year or every 3rd year for a year, that's a significant issue, and it's going to be hard, I think, to maintain that. Now, maybe that op-tempo will drop, and maybe we'll resolve some of these issues that we're using all of these troops for overseas, but that's an example of something to bring up. Here are some examples, and I'm just going to look at my notes here. It's hard for me to read those up there, of activities that were reported. As recent CASA activities. And one of them is, the first one I think is pretty interesting, since I'm a lawyer, that I can understand what the issues are. As you probably know, you have to be licensed in a state in order to practice law in a state. So if you're a spouse of a military member, and you want to work in that state, unless you're working for a federal agency, and that's really the only exception, you can't do legal work in that state under most bar rules. So there was a change to state regulations that were that some of the CASAs helped with soldier spouses who weren't allowed to practice in state law, and they pushed that so that they could practice in another state if they were stationed in that. So let's say I'm licensed in Nebraska, which was my first state where I was licensed, and I got stationed at, or my wife was a lawyer and licensed there, and we were stationed here in Kansas. Well, she couldn't practice in Kansas unless she took the bar exam or was able to waive in, and there are certain requirements to be able to waive in that aren't easy to meet. So now 16 states have changed their regulations to allow that, and it's based upon a state Supreme Court ruling in another state. So that's one benefit that's happened. The next one is just talking about medical care for veterans and soldiers. And it was on an island, I think it's Johnson Island is what they're talking about. And how many are familiar with Johnson Island? So do you want to tell people about Johnson Island, how big it is and how isolated it is?
Johnson's about an atoll. It's about 800 miles away from Hawaii, and that's where we deployed a lot of nuclear munitions in the early 60s.
And we have a military installation there, very tiny. I had a JAG school colleague who got stationed out there, and he said it's pretty isolated. But in any event, there just wasn't, there's only one physician on the island who could treat veterans, and they just didn't have any treatment for PTSD and other things, and there was a 3 to 4 month wait for the people on the island to be able to get medical care, so they worked on that. There's the one about the Army Twilight Tattoo Program. I guess they just that's more outreach to educate leaders about, business leaders about the Twilight. One of them helped set up a local Major League Baseball team military appreciations night. And speaking at flag days and things like that. So the one down at the very bottom is something I'm working on. Our metro area Chamber of Commerce, the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce, has a military affairs council, but it's kind of gone dormant. There's not much going on. So Kirby Brown and I worked together try to get that started up, as Kirby really took the lead in it, and then he recruited me, and I've been helping him. And so we're working on that, and the goal of the we call it the MAC, is to educate local employers on veteran skills, so we can assist military members who are transitioning to civilian life. It's been rewarding and frustrating. The people just don't understand the skill sets that the people in the Army have, and how they translate to civilian institutions. And on the other side of that, people getting out of the military don't really understand how to translate in their resumes and things like that the skill sets that they have to civilian speak. So it works both ways, but that's one of the things that the Metro Chamber of Commerce is trying to do. So I think I talked a little bit about the revision from 20 years to 10 years. And there used to be a senior title. I guess they've eliminated that. I think that's what our third CASA in Kansas was a senior, so I guess they eliminated it, so he's now just a CASA for Kansas. So one of the things that when I received my training or orientation was, we actually got to sit down with the secretary for about half an hour. There's just a group of 6 or 8, I think there were 8 of us. And we just sat around in his office. His office is about the size of this room here. It's pretty big. So there was plenty of room. But we sat around and just talked about different things. But he spent a lot of time talking about his priorities. And there are lots of things you could do as a CASA, but he wants us to focus on the Army National Guard and U.S. Army Reserve, working with them, trying to find out what their needs are, what those are. So the first thing I did when I came back was I scheduled this meeting with the local commander of the 35th Infantry Division. I also was able to meet with the TAG up in Iowa, find out about what they're doing up in Iowa, because they work with some of their troops end up deploying with the 35th. He wants us to help with recruiting. That's something I haven't been able to do a whole lot of, but I've had a couple of meetings set up with recruiting folks, the recruiting command locally, and those fell through. But one of his things is trying to get the story out so that people understand that there is a good opportunity in serving with the military. And then I think his biggest priority, at least he spent the most time talking about it, is the Soldier for Life program. Working with TAPS, working with all of these different organizations to help people transfer out, but also to his idea behind the Soldier for Life program is we want to inculcate into people who are getting out of the Army that same attitude that the Marines have. If you ask somebody, were you a Marine, they'll say, no, I wasn't a Marine, I am a Marine. You're a Marine for life. So he's trying to get that off the ground. I don't know how successful that's going to be. I forgot to wear, I've got a pin for it, but I forgot to wear it today. But that's something he's really focused on. And the idea behind it is that if you get people thinking like that, and you're out there as a civilian and you're employing people, you're going to think more about, all right, I want to help my brother or my sister from the military who's getting out. And so that's one of the big things that he really emphasizes. And then how do we kind of learn about all these different things that we're supposed to know about in the message? We are actually supposed to go to one conference every year, and then every other year to a regional conference. So the national conference, they'll have the secretary come there, and it's about a 2-day conference, and they'll go through a lot of different things. And he'll do presentations on what his priorities are. And it's a great opportunity not only to learn what the Army's story is and what he wants to emphasize, but it's also an opportunity to meet the other CASAs. Because they're 118 CASAs, they're not all going to be at every meeting, but you'll get to meet a lot of them, and especially the ones in our local region. And just this morning I got an email from the CASA down in Oklahoma asked me a question about some stuff and wanting to coordinate on something. So those conferences are very vital. Regional conferences, they do them every other year. And as I think I mentioned, I got to go to the Northwest Region Conference this year. It was great. It was in Billings, Montana. The weather wasn't all that great, but we got to do a staff ride at the Little Bighorn battlefield. They brought out 3 guys from the Army History, the Center for Military History, who walked us through the battle. It was fascinating, and they try to do something interesting like that at each one. The conference last year was at, the national conference was at West Point. I think, if you remember, there was a big storm. A lot of people got snowed in and snowed out. General Arter was not able to make it, and that was when they were going to give him his emeritus, elevated emeritus status, so he didn't get to attend. But this year I think it's going to be in Georgia, so I guess they tried to pick a place that the weather will cooperate better. Okay, I think we finished a little early, but I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions and just interaction. And first of all, how many people here, before you saw this flyer go out, knew about the CASA program? So we've got about 4 or 5, so maybe half. I know when I was in the Army, and I wasn't ever at the senior level where CASAs tend to meet the senior commanders, but I didn't know about the program, and I served it in 3 different divisions. I started off as an infantry officer at the 25th Infantry Division, as a JAG at the 101st Airborne, and so we dealt a lot with the headquarters, and I was an administrative law attorney for a portion of that time. Never knew about the CASA program, and I can understand why you wouldn't as a lieutenant, but I'm surprised I didn't. And then I spent some time with the 1st Infantry Division and didn't know about it. So the first time I learned about it was when I met General Arter, where we were on a board together, and he just happened to talk about it a little bit. And so it's a program, I think, that isn't something people are very familiar with, but I think if you, as a commander, or if you're in the civilian community or in the faculty, I've tried to meet with faculty here to find out what their needs are. And now I have to start following up with the things I found out about and to try to help them out. But questions? Yes?
Mike, you never mentioned, I'm sorry, wait a minute. Good presentation, thank you very much. I appreciate the information.
But you forgot something.
I wanted to make sure, is that, so you mentioned one time of recommendations for improvement. So as you take over this position and you get to learn the priorities of the secretary, what are your beginning thoughts on what things you're going to improve in this area?
Well, one of the things I think we have to improve, and I don't know, and I've been actually working on that with my other hat as a chairman of the foundation, is to educate the local community about what good work the Army does here at Fort Leavenworth, and what a resource we have, and what an impact it has on the local community. So that's one thing, but that's an easy one. And but I think one of the concerns I have is we've got to find a way to, with this op tempo with the Guard, to help our people who are in the Guard and Reserves, because they just can't. You can't progress in a job unless it's some job you can just unplug somebody and plug someone else in, like a factory position or something like that. But if you have a job that's an office job or something like that, where there are opportunities to move up, if you're not around when the promotions positions open up or something, you're not going to get that job. So it's really going to hinder you. And I asked the commander of the 35th Infantry Division how he dealt with that, and he was lucky. You know, he was the attorney, you know, the first deputy assistant to the attorney general in Kansas. So they get it. You know, they've got the tag there. That worked out fine for him. But that's not the case for a lot of people, and a lot of people are getting out of the Guard and Reserves because of that. So that's one of the things I've highlighted. I don't know. I don't have a solution. If you've got one, I'd like to know it. But those are some of the things that I've looked at. I met earlier this week with the local person who is the outreach vice president for the ESGR, the Employee Support for Guard and Reserves. Are you all familiar with that? So they work with employers to try to deal with those types of issues. And so one of the reasons I reached out to meet with her is to try to find out what are some of the things you're trying to recommend and what are some of the things that I can take back to the secretary. So that's another example. Other questions? Let me ask you a question. If you were in this position, how do you think you could do, you could respond to that question, what would you do that you think the secretary ought to know about or that we could improve that would make the Army a better institution? This is not for attribute. Well, I don't know. I guess it is. All right.
So you mentioned the priorities of secretary.
Right.
And so with those, so is Soldier for Life. And of course, the best sales people are the veterans.
Yes.
And so your knowledge and awareness of who the veterans are, not necessarily associated with Fort Leavenworth, but from Atchison to Wichita to
right.
Hiawatha, is that your ability to reach out to them to get them to be the advocacy for your particular missions. I think they're paramount in how they interact with recruiting stations, even knowing where recruiting stations are. The veterans, I think, and so how they reach out to community leadership.
That's a good point. Now, I'll mention one other thing that I forgot, and it's one of the best parts of having this job is we get to award 4 ROT scholarships a year to Guard and Reserve ROTC students. So one of them is a 4-year scholarship, which is pretty darn significant. I awarded one to a young woman from a small town in Kansas who graduated first in her class from high school. And it was you know, like 100-some people in her class, so it's not like, you know, she was first out of 3. She had an amazing record in high school. In her second semester of her senior year in high school, she enrolled in the Guard, went to, and then was in her summer training at the time that I made the appointment. So she was all in, and it's great. She's going to the University of Kansas now with a 4-year scholarship, ROTC scholarship. When she gets out, of course, when she finishes, she'll have to, there's some requirements to pay it back, just like anything else. I went to law school under the Army's Federal Legal Education Program, so I owed a 2-for-1. I'm sure that, I don't know what the obligation is, but there'll be some sort of an obligation associated with that. And then I can appoint 3 1-year scholarships. So that's an outreach thing too. And that's one thing that does help with the Guard and Reserve. I mean, if you can offer those types of programs to help people get through college, get commission, that's a big deal. Yes, sir.
Mr. Hockley, my name's Bray. How do you find to engage with the rest of the populace? Prime example is I'm a subscriber to the Kansas City Star, and absolutely nothing about the Army-Navy game in there. Not a darn thing.
You're right. I didn't.
And so you look at the local area. The local area doesn't, the populace doesn't seem to even consider the military, the Army. And so you're well engaged with the military side. What is CASA's venue to go out and push to the civilian side, you know, as the, you know, the advocate for the Army as the civilian aid?
Well, I can tell you a few things that I'm doing in that regard. I'm a member of the Overland Park Rotary Club, and I've had people come down from the class here to talk to them about what they do, and it's always very impressive. This isn't something I do as a CASA, but the International Officers Gala that we do downtown. The people that attend that come away astounded. A lot of what Doug and now Rod will be doing is that kind of outreach. But and then the other thing is, I think that the engagement through the Military Affairs Council of the Chamber of Commerce. You know, you think about who's members of the Chamber of Commerce. Those are our business leaders. So on that council, we have Terry Dunn, who's done construction. I think he's now retired as chairman of the board, but in the last 3 or 4 years, he's kind of moved from being the CEO to just chairman of the board. Now he's not on the board, but he's still a very powerful figure in the Kansas City community. We've got members who are from Cerner, some of the key folks from Cerner, and Cerner does a pretty good job hiring people. I mean, they're looking at it. It's not so much. I mean, for them, it's a resource to get good employees, but that's what we want. I mean, that's part of what my mission is to try to help the Army for Life program. There are people from Park University on it. There's folks from Honeywell. So that's one way to get out. I haven't figured out a lot of other ways, but making presentations. Let me see if I can go back to. So this spoke at Flag Day, Army Birthday event at Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. That would be one where you could highlight the Army. But some of those are, and there's this. Things like the spearheaded the Ask the Question statewide campaign for service projects relating to whether they served in the military, so that they can figure out whether they might be able to identify veterans who have PTSD or some other diagnosis that may relate to their service. It could be a physical ailment too, not just PTSD. So there are different things. These are good examples of things where they've raised awareness, but that is the challenge, and that's one of the things that I'm working on. Now, right now, I'm a full-time partner at a law firm. I figured out this past year that I've worked harder than ever because I've just kind of stacked this on top of all my work as a lawyer. But I'm getting close to retirement, so when I retire, I think I'll be able to spend a lot more time doing that. But that's a good point. Any other questions? Do you have any questions? Oh, you have a question? All right.
Last one, because Kansas City Star is in Missouri. I take it you must live in Overland Park.
I live in Overland Park,
You're a resident?
and I'm a resident of Kansas. I actually have an office in my law firm has an office in Overland Park and one in Kansas City, plus other cities.
Okay.
So I spend about 40% of my time in our Overland Park office.
Okay, but my question was, when you were talking and all that is, you have to be a resident of the state to be
a
CASA
CASA
here,
That's right.
but your contact information is in Missouri. How much overlap is that, or are you pretty strict on the state line? When you live in a metroplex, that's my whole point.
There's not a lot of.
Live in a metroplex, is that
because the
an advantage
metroplex
or
is
disadvantage?
so fluid. I mean, you don't even know when you cross the state line half the time. There's not a. I mean, there's no I don't have a boundary.
Okay.
I'm the CASA for the Kansas East, but if you think about Kansas East, you've got Fort Leavenworth, who a lot of their people are in Missouri. Even some of the students live in Missouri. Some of them live down in Johnson County. And one of the things that if you think about, you have to look at it in a metro-wide area, because one of the most important things in our area relating to this installation is the airport. I mean, that airport, I think I've read statistics, Cerner disputes them, but I've read that the Army, and Fort Leavenworth in particular, is the #1 user of the airport in terms of flights in. And that information came from the 27 committee right here in Leavenworth, and they did that analysis. And that doesn't count all the people going to Fort Riley. You know, people normally fly into out, and it doesn't count all the civilians, you know, who fly in just on vacations or going home to see their parents. And so it really is a metro-wide thing. The Chamber of Commerce, it's the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce. Businesses are members from all over. Even though I'm a member of the Overland Park Chamber of Commerce, my firm's also a member of the Greater Kansas City, and there's overlap between them too. So it really just kind of relates to, if I get the mission, you know, where we want to get the information out is to our area. And the sort of, you know, if you think about the population of the Kansas City area, even just Johnson County is 500,000 or 600,000 now. That's a big chunk of Kansas. I think the state has, what, 2.5 million, 3 million? So, Doug.
Along those lines, how many CASAs, whatever, are in Missouri? Do they have an
Missouri has an east and a west. Well, let me go back to my slide. Missouri has 3. So they have an east and a west. They must have a central. I'm not sure. I know the west person. I haven't met the other 2. So.
is there overlap?
Springfield?
That was my question.
Is there overlap with the, do you talk to and overlap with the Missouri West?
A little bit. I've been trying to reach out to that person, especially through the MAC. We're trying to get that person involved in the MAC. So far, we haven't been real successful, but yes, there is that overlap. That person doesn't live in the metro area, so really, if you think about it, I'm sort of the Kansas City CASA. But
That was my question.
We got time for one more question. After, I'll use host privilege to take one. We have at least 6 members of the faculty sitting here in the audience of the Command General Staff College or Army University. What could you as the CASA do for them? What advantage could you provide for them by now understanding, knowing who you are, that the program exists?
Well, I think, you know, from the faculty standpoint, I had the opportunity to meet with, and you know, I spent a lot of time in Kirby Brown's office. I've met with General Lundy many times, with General Efland. I have access to them, and if you have concerns or things that you think might make the school work better, it's certainly, you can come to me and say, here's an idea to float by them. I don't have to tell them who told me, but I can just say, you know, I've been out talking to the faculty, and one of the things they mentioned was XYZ. If that's something, but you know, you got to make sure it's something good. You know, if it's just like pay me more, well, that's probably not, that's out of their control. But if there are suggestions about the school, or you know, right now, Army University is standing up. There are a lot of things I think that the faculty could provide input on, and maybe I'm stepping on your toes there, but that's something we're trying to figure out. We meaning the Army, not me. And so that would be something that you could do. And I know I've met with the department heads to find out more about what they do. There are, as an example, the Commander General Staff College Foundation, you know, provides support to the college. There are things that, you know, as a faculty member, if you're saying, well, I really like this support, well, maybe the foundation can't do that, but maybe if I go to the commanders, I can say, well, you know, they'd really like to get XYZ speaker in, or some sort of new program, or, you know, we ought to spend more time on ethics. That could be a way to bring it in kind of as through the back door without poking your head up to get a shot off. Okay, well, thank you very much for spending the time with me and taking the time out of your lunch to meet here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, sir.
Oh, thank you. Now you're going to get a cone.
Thank you all for coming. We'll remind you once again, our next presentation will be 30 January with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI folks right here. We invite you to be there. If you haven't seen the latest edition of our Interagency Journal, you can pick that up down by the Foundation office or throughout the building, the last 2 editions, and there's a couple copies here. Please help yourself. Thank you. Everybody have a safe, happy holiday.